Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Jared, we'll be discussing the work of the Sinclair Performance Institute, but you have quite a fascinating background that I'd like you to share with us this morning.
Karl, good morning. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I grew up in California. Right out of high school, I joined the military in the Marine Corp, worked several positions from management positions. If you're familiar with the United States Marine Corps, they push leadership down to the lowest level in any organization. So decisions can be made despite what's occurring on the battlefield or during peacetime or anything like that. I also found myself in a lot of training positions at the Marine Corps because training is very important. I ended up managing several teams, deployed to Afghanistan. After my time in the Marine Corps, I did 10 years. I got out, and it was kind of a horrible job market in 2008, and I had a difficult time finding work. So I ended up going back to Iraq as a contractor. About 3 years ago, I left that department following grad school. So the completion of grad school, I went to USC, got a degree in organizational change and leadership. So with that doctorate, I really started bolstering Sinclair Performance Institute.
So what did you learn from your various roles that helped you establish the Sinclair Performance Institute?
I would say the biggest one that I figured out and came to learn was the stick-to-itiveness, if you will, of making things happen. We have the resources and the experts within our own networks and our own organizations if we're just brave enough to activate them and allow them to work. So I would say that and the tenacity to get things done. That's been the biggest shift that I've had to make since I left the military service and the law enforcement service, where that everything's not an emergency. It needs to be done, but it just needs to be done right, not necessarily right now.
So what is the Sinclair Performance Institute and what services do you provide?
Yeah, so we're a capacity building advisory firm. We focus on building organizations' capacity to perform at higher levels. We also assist with change management initiatives and advisory services, leadership development, learning and development, and then we have a small portion of our business that does executive coaching. And as you can imagine, if your listeners know much about capacity building, change, or leadership, or learning and development, a lot of times those components of those disciplines are interwoven in each of those respective spaces. So it works out nicely.
So typically, what type of clients do you work with?
Our clients are typically sub 10 million, and recently we've gotten into the education space. That's where we find ourselves now. We've worked a lot with nonprofits. We first started, we cut our teeth working with nonprofits, doing pro bono work for nonprofits, and we still maintain a small portfolio assisting nonprofits, anything from the veteran space to homelessness to hunger alleviation.
And did you find, Jared, that when COVID kicked in, that a lot of senior managers took that opportunity to leave businesses and maybe leave a management deficit behind?
I think a lot of the leadership and management or accountability, if you will, that was in place pre-COVID, due to those COVID restrictions and the Great Resignation and organizations wanting to hold on to their workforces because they have to maintain certain levels of service and manufacturing or quality. I think a lot of those accountabilities and that quality of work and that quality and involvement of leadership decreased. And coming off of COVID, there's a big gap there. And we're seeing it right now, at least in some of the clients that we're working with, is they're trying to shore up those gaps in leadership and in management effectiveness and in accountability that were created due to COVID and their desire to just maintain a workforce, not necessarily a super effective workforce, but to maintain just people doing work.
So did you find that businesses in general tolerated poor performance during the pandemic just to get through?
I think it was, yeah. I think it was a change management or a cultural change that occurred or a shift that occurred. And the challenge is decisions that were made to maintain workforce or maybe to reduce accountabilities or to kind of reduce pressure on the workforce had underlying consequences. And we're seeing those consequences now where having these low-performing individuals in organizations, we're having this tolerance for poor performance. And I think what happened is through COVID, those changes occurred, not necessarily intentionally, but now we're having to deal with the consequences of those because organizations are realizing that, hey, this level of performance isn't working for us now, so we need to tighten things up a little bit. This level of leadership might not be working or accountability might not be working, so it's a consequence of that.
So is it just about now at this stage that lots of companies are realizing that cultural change has happened and want to address it?
I do. I think it's being reflected in their balance sheets. I think if they're paying attention to their KPIs and some of the other metrics that they use to measure their organization, I think they've seen that turnover is high. I think they're probably seeing that the tenure at the leadership level, those years are becoming younger. I know specifically in the government space, the local government space, you have a lot of leaders or a lot of people that are being thrust into leadership positions that might have only been with an organization for 4 or 5 years. So I think if you peel back the layers and really take an assessment of an organization, you look at the data, a lot of these organizations are going to see that their performance has decreased. Perhaps their complaints have increased. Perhaps their tenure at the leadership or management levels has decreased as well as far as an age perspective is concerned.
So once they've realized that there's a problem, how do they go about resolving that?
Yes, there's a problem, and that means they have a sense that they've missed the mark. So I think in order to address that, we have to address what would the mark be? And then if we're here now and we have a future mark or a future metric that we want to meet or a future level of performance that we want to meet, how do we get there? So really diving into that gap. And then once you get into that gap, identifying what are the root causes. And, it sounds very simplistic, but it's not. It's diving into those root causes and then developing interventions to address those root causes. And typically what we look at, and what I would recommend organizations look at, is 5 things. We call it the SMAC philosophy. You got to look at your systems. You got to look at the motivational orientations of individuals and teams, accountability systems, which is the A. You got to look at communications, which is the C. How is the organization communicating what matters, what doesn't matter, how well people are doing, how well people aren't doing? And then lastly, you have to look at this knowledge component. And, leadership might play into that knowledge component. Maybe it's a skills deficit. Maybe they have the skills, but they don't have the motivation to apply the skills. So we use that SMAC framework, systems, motivation, accountability, communication, and knowledge in order to wrap up the organization and help them close those gaps.
Certainly sounds like a smart approach, but where should the priority be as a starting point for businesses?
Motivation. Something's not being done. We need to find out why people aren't doing that work. And oftentimes motivation is the key to that. So there's either an approach or an avoidance component to that. There might be an expectation component or a value component. And whether it's approach, avoidance, expectation, or value, those are all underlying things of individual motivation, of things that will help people drive and work towards a certain goal. So I think motivation is critical. The second, if I were to put a close second on that, it would be, what is that goal? What is that mark that you need people to work towards? And with that comes communication, identifying it, and all those things. But bottom line is motivation is key.
And from your experience, what's the best way to motivate people?
I think when you peel back the layers, accountability is a nasty word. People don't like to talk about it. It has a connotation of being, kind of in your face and just abrasive and whatnot. But accountability doesn't have to be that. Basically, accountability will help people and organizations get to where they want to go. I think if we take a step back and we look at all the things that are going wrong, whether it's in business or government or the world, or even with our own families, or maybe the kids' football or rugby team, when we look at the things that are not going quite so well, it comes down to accountability. Accountability of that leadership to lead their people. Accountability of those managers to measure how their people are doing. Accountability of, the coach to the rugby player saying, hey, you didn't do that so well. You need to push the ball this way instead of that side on the field, and here's why. I think sometimes we have a reluctance to address those issues and confront other people. So accountability is vitally important to get organizations to move forward and having those candid, direct, data-driven conversations.
And not only during COVID did many organisations lose their leaders, but they also now have to grapple with managing a remote team. From your insights and experience in this space, what are the greatest companies doing with managing remote teams?
Yeah, there's a whole spectrum there. We have companies on one side that are being super hands-on with managing their teams, taking screenshots. You got to jiggle the mouse to keep your computer turned on. And you have teams on the other side of the spectrum that have hired quality people and are equipping those people with the resources, the time, and the teams that they need to do the work. And I think the most successful teams that are either working in a remote or hybrid space are hiring the right people, equipping them with the time and the resources and the teams needed to do the work, and they're setting them free. They're allowing them to go forward with self-determination and autonomy and to solve some of these critical problems that these organizations are working on.
For those leaders then that stayed in place with the organisation during COVID, leadership fatigue is certainly a problem out there today. How should that be managed?
The critical component in leadership fatigue, again, goes back to accountability. Oftentimes, in a leader's fatigue scenario, they are the one to blame. And through some executive coaching, they become to realize that, where delegation becomes very important. When you're trying to make change, when you're trying to improve performance, because a single leader, a single team of leaders can't do everything. They can drive the vision, but they're not going to be doing the work. So they need to be able to delegate to people that are equipped and skilled to do the work, that are motivated to do the work. And when that work is done, they can be held accountable through awards, recognition, etc. But also when that work is not done, it creates more work for them, leading to increased pressure, more fatigue. When they get fatigued and they get burnt out, they start to resent the work that they're doing. They might resent certain people within our organization. So by not delegating and not holding people accountable, I would say that is one of the biggest things that I see at the executive level of executives getting burnt out, is not delegating enough and then not taking on that accountability and that visionary perspective.
And Jared, finally, what are the attributes of an influential leader?
I think the attributes of an influential leader are being present, being able to take bad news. You know, I had a boss back in the day that said, "Bad news, welcome here." And he wasn't one of those people that just said it. They meant it. And he had a sign on his wall in his office that said, "Bad news is welcome here." And I think that's it. I think when our people feel safe to approach us with bad news, and they know that we're going to work through that, and they're going to get an honest, caring, thoughtful, present response from that leader, there's a lot of value there, because they know that they're going to have the support that they need from that leader in order to do it. And they're not going to get their head bitten off when they go in that office and tell them. The alternative is that the leader lives in an information deficit. And we see that too. The higher you get in an organization, the less information, the less detailed information, and less nuanced information you have. So if you're open and you're willing to engage your folks to be present, you will build that trust that you need to be an influential leader.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.